They followed the sounds. It sounded like children. They crept closer to the edge of the pit and looked down. They saw what was crying. They couldn't believe their eyes. It was August 1150 and today was the day. It had been dry for long enough. Hob and the other villagers left for the fields. With their scythes they walked along the dirt track until they met a small group of men. They had been waiting for them. Traditionally, reapers were employed during the period of gathering or harvesting the produce from the fields. Their payment would be food and lodging in the village. The groups merged and they carried on together, with the men leading the way talking and the women and children behind. Some of the children were playing and singing as they went. They started with the furthest field on the very edge of town, right near the Woolpits. The very things that gave the town its name. The day was hot and the men cut the grain with the sickles. The women and children followed behind, collecting and bundling it up. But every now and again they stopped, as on the wind, very faintly, they could just about hear a very gentle sound. Later that day they were resting under the shade of the trees. It was quiet and the villagers could hear the sound more clearly. They looked around. No one was sure where it was coming from or what the noise was even saying. They looked around, trying to find the sound. They broke up into groups to search, when all of a sudden, a boy called to them, and he was frantically waving for them to come over. He was standing at the edge of one of the wolf pits looking down. They hurried over to him and looked where his eyes fell. Their mouths fell open. Some of the villagers gasped in shock and stepped away from the deep hole. With the villagers and the labourers standing around the top of the pit, the noises had now stopped. But no one moved, and no one said a word. They all just stood staring into the pit. Curled up at the bottom of this pit were two small children, a girl and a younger boy. Some of the older members of the crowd tried talking to the children, who just stared back in fear and confusion. A few of the older boys from the village were sent to find something for the children to use to climb out of the pit. And when they got back, the children were speaking, but what sounded like complete nonsense. No one could understand a word the children said. A tree trunk was lowered into the corner, so the children could climb out using it as a ladder. But when they got to the top and climbed out into the sunlight, the villagers stepped back in horror. The skin of the two children was wrong, and the villagers didn't know what they should do. They sent for the abbot, Ralph of Coggeshall, who would later be one of the ones who would document this event. The villagers also sent for the landowner, Sir Richard de Calm. When the two men arrived at Woolpit, Hob led them into a crowd that had gathered under a group of trees, and as they drew closer, they could feel the crowd's excitement. But when they got close, the people moved out the way, and it went silent. Sir Richard and the abbot froze, staring at the children, unblinking. The two terrified young children were holding on to each other in the middle of the crowd. Two green children. Their skin was green, and they were clad in garments of strange material and colour. When Sir Richard inquired about the children and if they had said anything, the crowd said that they couldn't be understood and they had refused any food offered to them, but drank some water. Sir Richard de Calm took the children back to his home, where again he offered them food, kneeling down and taking a bite himself to show them what to do, but again and again they repeatedly refused to eat, and this carried on for days. They were now reaching the point of being very weak, when out in Richard de Cam's garden the children came across some green beans, which they ate straight off the ground. One of the children's carers went running back inside shouting, "They're eating! They're eating!" Sir Richard came out to find people plucking beans from the plants and feeding them to the hungry children. Relieved that they were now eating, beans were gathered and fed to the children daily, and slowly Sir Richard got them to start eating bread. And as time went on, they started to eat more and more food, and as the children ate, the green colour of their skin faded until they looked just like normal children. And as the months went by, people noticed the young girl adjusted well and started learning English, but the younger child, the boy, seemed distant and depressed. It was then decided that the children should now be baptised, but shortly after this, the young boy grew ill, and everything was done to try and save his young life, but unfortunately, he passed away. As the years went by, the young girl, now christened Agnes, continued to work for Richard de Cam, and for many years after, she was repeatedly asked where they came from and why the skin was once green. She would always reply with the same answer: "We are inhabitants of the land St. Martin, who is regarded with peculiar veneration in the country which gave us birth. We are ignorant of how we arrived here. We only remember this, that on a certain day when we were feeding our father's flocks in the fields, we heard a great sound, such as we are now accustomed to hear at St. Edmund's when the bells are chiming, and whilst listening to the sound in admiration, we became on a sudden, as it were, entranced, and found ourselves among you in the fields that you were reaping." And when asked to describe their home St. Martin's Land, she replied, "The sun does not rise upon our countrymen. Our land is little cheered by its beams. We are contented with the twilight, which among you precedes the sunrise or follows the sunset. Moreover, a certain luminous country is seen, not far distant from ours, and divided from it by a very considerable river." Over the years, the story of the green children of Woolpit was recounted and altered, but it appeared first by two different chroniclers in the 13th century historian William of Newburgh and his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, which means History of English Affairs, from 1220, and the 12th century abbot Ralph of Coggeshall. But Newburgh and Coggeshall both tell a similar story of how the two green children appeared in the village of Woolpit, and based their accounts on witnesses. As she grew older, the girl married the Archdeacon of Ely, Richard Barr, in King's Lynn. She became Agnes Barr, and according to one report, the pair had at least one child. A second account by William Newburgh also recorded Agnes's reply. "On a certain day, when we were feeding our father's flocks in the fields, we heard a great sound, such as we now are accustomed to hear at St. Edmund's, when the bells are chiming," she said. "And whilst listening to the sound in admiration, we became on a sudden, as it were, entranced, and found ourselves among you in your fields where you were reaping. And again, she said, the sun does not rise upon our countrymen, our land is little cheered by its beams. We are contented with the twilight, which among you precedes the sunrise or follows the sunset." She explained, according to Newburgh, "Moreover, a certain luminous country is seen, not far from us, and divided from it by a very considerable river." As you can see, the two writers record something very similar. And the now ruins of the abbey in Bury St. Edmunds, a small town near Woolpit, which might be whose bells the green children of Woolpit recall hearing. Upon further questioning, she said that her country was Christian and it had churches, but otherwise it was quite different from England. Woolpit, or in Old English, Wolfpit, is an ancient village in Suffolk named after an old pit for catching wolves. The legend of the green children of Woolpit starts either during the reign of King Stephen, in a rather tumultuous time in England's history called the Anarchy, in the mid-12th century, or the time of Henry II. St. Martin's Land could have been what is now Farnham St. Martin, which is about 8 miles from Woolpit. Also, Many Flemish people died during the Battle of Fornham St Martin in 1173. And if the family was killed off and they were forced to flee, this would explain why the children were found alone. The green skin has been suggested to be chlorosis, which is now thought of as anemia, caused by severe iron deficiency, and presents with greenish pallor of the skin, along with other symptoms like reduced appetite and pica, where people eat odd things like sand or clay. Well, that'll about do it. But to let you know, there are many other theories about the two children, which are still believed today. And these are that they were actually Fae children, or that they were aliens from outer space, as people love throwing aliens at stuff from the past. And in 1621, a Mr. Robert Burton wrote in the Anatomy of Melancholy that the green children of Woolpit fell from heaven. A number of people and local folklore believe that they live in caves and caverns underground, and these two children ventured out and got lost and could not find their way back underground. But for me personally, it might be true about the children being Flemish immigrants who were killed by King Stephen or King Henry II, who were killed during the reign of King Stephen or King Henry II. So, that'd explain why the villagers of Woolpit mistook the gibberish what might have actually been Dutch, and the twilight described by the children could have been the leafy darkness of nearby Thetford Forest. And some say the skin colour could be the result of poisoning, but I believe the other explanation, which is, in my opinion, more likely, that the green skin colour would be chlorosis, which results from malnutrition, and may explain why the green skin colour faded away when they adjusted to a better diet. Some people believe they never existed at all, but do let me know in the comments below what you think, and if this story is just that, a story, or that there might be some truth here. I also want to thank NB328888 for asking me to cover this tale. If you want me to cover a story, feel free to get in touch. And if you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe. And that'll do. Take care.